storm wrecked his bridge before the war had even begun. According to Herodotus, the king answered by having the sea itself whipped and cursed. Not in city, not a rebel, the water. That was Xerxes, a ruler so absolute he expected nature to obey, and now he was marching that certainty straight into Greece with an empire at his back. If that sounds insane, stay with me. It was also the logic of empire. By the time his army moved west, the Persian Empire already stretched across continents. It was the greatest political machine on earth, and he sat at the center of it. He was not some reckless tribal chief wandering into a foreign war. He was the heir of Cyrus and Darius, born inside a palace culture that treated world rule as normal. But Greece was a different kind of enemy. It was divided, stubborn, poor by imperial standards, and almost impossible to bully into behaving like a province. Xerxes came to finish what Marathon had left unfinished. What he found was the first limit he could not simply order away. Xerxes was the son of Darius the Great and Atassa, daughter of Cyrus. In blood alone, he carried two of the biggest names in Persian history. He was not Darius's eldest son, but he had something stronger than age on his side. He was born after his father had already become king, and his mother's lineage was unmatched. Before he ever wore the crown, he had already governed Babylonia. He learned early that empires were held together by roads, grain, tribute, and fear. When Darius died in 486 BCE, Xerxes inherited more than a throne. He inherited revolt in Egypt, trouble in Babylon, and the memory of Marathon. He also inherited a father-sized shadow. Darius had expanded Persia magnificently, but Marathon left an unfinished sentence hanging over the dynasty. For a new king, unfinished wars are dangerous. Ignore them, and you look timid. Pursue them, and you stake your reign on outcomes you do not control. A weak king might have hesitated. Xerxes did not. He crushed unrest in Egypt with force, then turned on Babylon when it rose against Persian rule. Whatever softer language earlier kings used, Xerxes ruled with a colder edge. Some historians think his reign marked a harder imperial tone. Old political fictions were stripped away and the message became brutally clear. The empire was not a partnership, it belonged to the king. And yet Greece was not his first obsession. Ancient sources suggest men around him, especially Mardonius, pushed hard for a renewed invasion. Revenge for Marathon mattered. So did prestige. So did the simple imperial logic that a king of kings did not ignore defiance on the edge of his world. At court, the case for war was easy to make. Athens and Eretria had aided revolt before. Marathon had stained Persian prestige, and success promised immortal glory. Once Xerxes committed, he did it on a scale that only Persia could imagine. This would not be a raid or a warning strike. It would be a moving continent. For years, the empire prepared. Troops came from every corner of Persian power, speaking different languages and carrying different weapons under one royal command. Cavalry from the Iranian world, archers from the east, sailors from Phoenicia and Egypt, contingents from Anatolia, levies from lands the Greeks barely knew existed. Even the paperwork behind it must have been staggering. Routes, fodder, rations, ships, interpreters, commanders, and timetables all had to move together. To the Greeks, it looked like the whole world was coming. In a sense, it was. But the size of the expedition was only part of the story. Xerxes also prepared the road itself, as if he meant to prove geography was another servant. A canal was cut across the neck of land near Mount Athos, avoiding waters that had wrecked an earlier Persian fleet. Storehouses were stocked, routes organized, supply turned into strategy. Seen from Persia, this was not madness. It was administration on a heroic scale, the empire proving it could think in mountains and seas. This was empire at its most disciplined. Then came the Hellespont. To invade Greece by land, Xerxes had to bring Asia into Europe. So engineers threw bridges of boats across the strait and turned water into highway. A storm destroyed the first attempt. That is where Herodotus places the famous scene of the sea punished, and the builders punished too. Whether every detail is literal almost misses the point. The story survived because it felt true to the kind of power Xerxes represented. He believed obstacles existed to be mastered. When the bridges were rebuilt, the crossing became one of the great set pieces of ancient war. Day after day, men, horses, wagons, and equipment poured into Europe. Somewhere in that endless movement was the promise of victory. Somewhere in it, too, was the first danger. Huge armies impress the eye. They also eat, slow down, stretch thin, and depend on perfect coordination. Xerxes was gambling that imperial scale itself could crush resistance. If the Greeks saw enough banners and enough dust, maybe they would submit before the hardest fighting began. Some did. Northern Greek states made terms, and others waited carefully to see which way the war would lean. The Greeks themselves helped create the opening. Rivalries between city-states made united resistance painfully difficult, and Xerxes knew fear could do work. Armies did not. But a smaller coalition chose to resist, and in resisting, it forced Xerxes into a war of choke points. Narrow passes, tight straits, and difficult ground kept rising in front of him. Exactly the kind of places where an empire size stopped looking like pure strength. The first great gate was Thermopylae, mountains on one side, sea on the other, and a pass so narrow numbers could not spread the way Xerxes wanted. Greek defenders, including the Spartan king Leonidas, held there long enough to make the invasion feel costly. Not impossible, costly. Xerxes still broke through. A mountain path exposed the Greek position, and the pass was taken after a stand that became legend. The Persian victory at Thermopylae was real, but it was not clean in the way imperial propaganda would have preferred. Even success had to be purchased. For Persia, it was a breakthrough. For Greece, it became a story powerful enough to outlive defeat itself. At sea, near Artemisium, fighting unfolded in parallel. The Persian fleet did not shatter the Greek navy quickly enough to end the campaign in one smooth stroke. That mattered more than it first seemed. Xerxes could win on land and still remain tied to the sea. Then the road opened south. Greek resistance folded back, and Attica lay exposed before the king. Athens was evacuated. Its people fled to ships and nearby islands, leaving their city to the enemy and their fate to the water. Xerxes entered the symbolic heart of resistance and found it nearly empty. A few defenders held out on the Acropolis, but they were overcome. The city was sacked and burned. For any ruler obsessed with symbols, Athens mattered beyond its walls. It was punishment, theater, and warning all at once. If you freeze the story there, Xerxes looks unstoppable. Thermopylae behind him, Athens in flames, Greece broken open before the King of Kings. This was the moment Persian power seemed to justify itself. The roads had worked, the bridges had held, and the coalition had failed to stop him. Somewhere above the smoke, Xerxes could look across a conquered landscape and believe the argument was settled. Empire had arrived, and the smaller world was learning its place. It is hard to imagine a more intoxicating picture. The richest monarch alive, master of a multinational army standing over the most famous city in Greece. And this is exactly where the danger sharpened. Victory can hide a ruler's weakness better than defeat ever will. Xerxes had achieved what his father never did. He had carried Persian power deep into mainland Greece and humbled the enemy before all of Hellas. But conquering territory is not the same as ending a war. Burning a city is not the same as breaking a coalition. Xerxes had broken places. He had not yet broken the Greek habit of fighting on after disaster. That struggle now narrowed to the sea. As long as the Greek fleet survived, Persia could not move and feed its army freely along the coast. Xerxes had the larger navy on paper, but raw size meant less in cramped waters, and his best chance may have been patience. The Persian fleet included excellent sailors, especially Phoenicians, but command at that scale was never simple. Different contingents still had to move as one. Instead, the campaign pulled him toward one decisive blow. The Greeks were divided, frightened, and arguing among themselves, yet they were not finished. Off Salamis, they offered him something irresistible, the chance to end everything at once. Quick pause here, because this is the turning point where people split hard on Xerxes. Do you see him as a reckless tyrant blinded by scale, or as a serious emperor making the logical move after taking Athens? Drop your answer in the comments, because once the fleets enter that strait, the whole story changes. And for Xerxes, it changes fast. He had choices. He could wait, pressure the Greeks, or let division rot their alliance from the inside. A patient emperor might have let fear do the work. According to the ancient tradition, the mysticals helped bait the Persians into battle. Whether Xerxes saw the full trap or not, he accepted combat where Greek seamanship mattered most. The Straits of Salamis compressed the Persian advantage. Too many ships, too little room. Too much confusion once movement lost its rhythm. In open water, numbers could spread and surround. In a bottleneck, numbers could jam, collide, and trap one another. That is the difference Xerxes failed to respect. He treated the sea like another plane waiting to be overrun. From shore, the king is said to have watched the battle unfold. Imagine the confidence at dawn, then the spreading disbelief as the formation thickened into chaos. Greek triremes struck where crowded Persian ships could not turn cleanly. Oars shattered, hulls tangled, and commands died in the noise. Salamis was not just a defeat, it was the moment Persian abundance became Persian vulnerability. And once the fleet lost command of those waters, the entire invasion changed shape. Supply lines grew uncertain, and time began helping the Greeks. Invasion campaigns are really arguments with time. At Salamis, time stopped sounding Persian and started speaking Greek. Xerxes still had a vast army, but an army that large could not simply live off hostile ground forever. He had entered Greece as the embodiment of imperial certainty. After Salamis, certainty turned into calculation. This is where his fatal flaw becomes clear. Xerxes had spent the campaign assuming scale and authority could force reality into obedience. Bridges over straits, canals through land, a coalition terrified into collapse. One more push and the problem disappears. But Greece kept turning into places where force had to think. Thermopylae, Artemisium, Salamis. Each stage narrowed his choices. The god-king met geography, local resolve, and bad conditions for his strengths. None of those things could be intimidated. So Xerxes made the decision every conqueror hates. He withdrew to Asia with much of his army and left Mardonius to continue the war. That choice was practical, maybe necessary. It was also devastating to the image he had carried into Greece. The man who crossed the Hellespont to finish the campaign in person was now going home while the outcome remained unsettled. The aura of inevitability had cracked. Retreat did not mean total collapse. Persia remained vastly powerful, and Xerxes could still present the move as strategic. Mardonius tried to salvage the mission. He wintered in Greece, courted allies, and sought to break the coalition politically as much as militarily. Athens was taken again for a time, which shows the war was not instantly won after Salamis, but Persian momentum was gone. The following year, the decisive land battle came at Plataea. Xerxes was not there. His general was. And when Mardonius was killed and the Persian army broke, the invasion truly died. Plataea mattered because it removed the Persian attempt to hold ground in Greece with a major field army. After that, permanent conquest stopped looking real. At roughly the same broad turn of the war, Persian naval power in the Aegean was hit again at Mycale. Land and sea both tilted the same way. Greece had not destroyed the Persian Empire, but it had stopped Persia from mastering mainland Greece, and that mattered enormously to both sides. For the Greeks, Xerxes became the image of overwhelming power turned back. For Persia, the campaign became an expensive failure no spectacle could hide. And once a ruler built on awe loses awe, every later achievement is judged against the failure. Victory elsewhere rarely erases the one defeat everyone remembers. Yet this is where easy storytelling gets lazy. Salamis and Plataea did not make Xerxes a clown, a madman, or a fool. He had organized one of the most ambitious military operations the ancient world had ever seen. He had reached farther into Greece than any Persian king before him. His error was not simple stupidity. It was the deeper imperial habit of believing that because so much had yielded before him, the final obstacle would yield too. That habit often looks like strength right up to the moment it meets its limit. Then it suddenly looks like blindness. After the Greek disaster, Xerxes did not spend the rest of his life charging back west. The dream of finishing Greece never returned in the same form. He turned again toward the business of ruling a vast empire. Administration, court politics, and royal building projects reclaimed the center of his reign. This is the quieter half of many conquerors' lives. After the thunder comes paperwork, audiences, ceremonies, and the long effort to make authority look unbroken. At Persepolis, the palace world still glittered. Reliefs still showed ordered delegations from many peoples bringing tribute to the king. On stone, empire remained serene. In memory, though, Greece had carved a wound into it. In that sense, Xerxes spent his later years doing what powerful rulers often do after a public setback. He performed stability. That contrast is one of the most revealing things about him. In the palace, perfect order. In the field, a world stubborn enough to refuse the script. He was not destroyed in one afternoon at Salamis. He was undone by the belief that everything, sooner or later, must submit. Even his death did not come with the grandeur of his invasion. In 465 BCE, Xerxes was killed in a court conspiracy inside the world of palace intrigue. That ending feels strangely fitting. The king who once moved nations fell not to a heroic rival, but to the hidden violence of his own court. Greek writers made much of him, often with open hostility. In their telling, Xerxes became excess made human, arrogant, emotional, theatrical, too large for good judgment. That image shaped the West for centuries. It is powerful, memorable, and not entirely fair. The surviving narrative is heavily Greek because Greek texts endured. That alone should make us cautious about reducing Xerxes to the villain in someone else's victory story. Persian kingship really was built on immense ceremony and near unimaginable authority. Xerxes did command resources that smaller states could barely comprehend. But he was also a functioning ruler of a sophisticated empire, not just a cartoon of luxury and rage. He inherited hard problems and solved some of them effectively. If anything, the truth is more interesting than the caricature. Xerxes was capable, disciplined, and formidable, which is exactly why his failure means so much. Weak men lose and teach us little. Powerful men lose by exposing the weakness inside power itself. That is why his story still works. Not just because Spartans died at Thermopylae or triremes crashed at Salamis, but because the man behind the invasion feels recognizable. He wanted the final answer. He wanted the clean demonstration that the world's biggest empire could end resistance by appearing at full size. Instead, Greece handed him the oldest lesson in statecraft. There are limits force discovers only after it arrives. Mon viewers still recognize the pattern instantly. A leader surrounded by resources, convinced scale guarantees obedience until one narrow decision proves otherwise. And that is Xerxes' real legacy, not merely the king who invaded Greece, but the ruler who showed that magnitude and control are not the same thing. He remains enormous in memory because the scale was enormous. Bridges over the Hellespont, fire over Athens, fleets crowding the straits, a continent on the move. But what survives longest is smaller and sharper, the image of a man who could command almost everything except restraint. If you enjoy this story, leave a like. It helps more people find these rulers at their most human, not just their most famous. And subscribe if you want more cinematic histories of emperors, conquerors, and the moments when power looked invincible right before it cracked. In the comments, tell me which ruler we should cover next. Someone who built an empire, someone who broke one, or someone who nearly held both in his hands. Because the line from Xerxes does not end in Greece. It runs forward into every age that mistakes size for certainty. Next time, we may follow another giant who seemed untouchable at the height of his power. And just like Xerxes, his real enemy may be hiding inside his greatest strength. Until then, remember the sight that defined him best. A king staring over the water, convinced the world could be arranged by command. And if you want the next fall from the top, stay close, because another ruler is already riding toward the edge.